Among the many books and articles published in the 1970s and early 1980s on the relationship between feminism and Marxism, one can identify 4 different explanations of the specificity of gender oppression. First, femininity as alienation. Second, the relationship of domestic labor to the reproduction of labor power. Third, an ideology of domination independent of the mode of production. Fourth, the mental manual division of labor. Is this too fast or is okay? Okay. In her Femininity as Alienation, Women and the Family in Marxism and Psychoanalysis, Anne Forman has tried to theorize the specificity of women's oppression under capitalism on the basis of her understanding of the concepts of alienation and reification in Marx. She argues that the capitalist mode of production, on the one hand, separated the sphere of labor from the domestic sphere, and on the other hand, turned labor into an activity devoid of creativity, which destroyed the individuality of the producer. With the intensification of alienation at work, humans attempted to express themselves outside the workplace and in phenomena such as the family and gender identities, such as femininity and masculinity. In a world of chaos and change, gender appears as the one element of continuity to which individuality can be attached. Forman argues that Freud's understanding of the sexual drive as the main factor in social and political relations is really only true in a capitalist system based on alienated labor and reified human relations. On the one hand, capitalism, in contrast to prior systems, emphasizes human individuality. On the other hand, this individuality expresses itself in an alienated way and based on the separation of pleasure from consciousness. In Forman's opinion, the capitalist ideology of reification acts on the level of the unconscious and not necessarily on a conscious level. Identities such as femininity or masculinity, which have been formed as a result of specific historical circumstances, appear as natural and eternal characteristics. At the same time, Forman emphasizes that women's increasing participation in social production challenges accepted norms of female conduct and leads to the instability of the family. Forman writes, "In our understanding, the structuring of the psyche into a conscious and unconscious area is dependent on the process of reification in capitalist society. If men were to overcome reification, then the dynamic for this form of mental structuring would cease. As a result, the predominant understanding of sexuality and the importance of masculinity and femininity would wane. Sexuality would not become unimportant, but it will be expressed in a conscious and polymorphous form. In other words, Forman thinks that the structuring of the psyche into a conscious and an unconscious area is itself the product of a system in which humans cannot live consciously and establish a two-way relationship between mind and body or reason and desire. At the same time, such a two-way relationship will not signify the disappearance of desires, but a more conscious way of expressing them." In contrast to Anne Forman, many socialist feminists attempted to explain the specificity of women's oppression in capitalism by focusing on the relationship of women's domestic labor to Marx's theory of surplus value. In her Marxism and the Oppression of Women Toward a Unitary Theory, Lise Vogel has summarized the different arguments of the theorists of this tendency. She concludes that women's domestic labor does not produce value, but is related to the capitalist mode of production because of its role in reproducing labor power. After drawing some limited distinctions between the views of Marx and those of Engels and evaluating their defects as well as the defects of the entire socialist tradition, she claims that although working class and upper class women all suffer from inequality with men, the specific basis of women's oppression in all class societies is the appropriation of the surplus labor of direct producers by the ruling class. Then she argues that under capitalism, which is based on the separation of the realm of labor from the domestic sphere, women increasingly fall behind in the process of production during the period of childbirth and child-rearing. Because of their ability to reproduce the next generation of workers, women are placed under men's control. In order to stabilize the reproduction of labor power as well as to keep the amount of necessary labor at acceptable levels, the ruling class encourages male supremacy within the exploited class. She concludes, "It is the provision by men of means of subsistence to women during the childbearing period and not the sex division of labor in itself that forms the material basis for women's subordination in class society." Vogel thinks that the only way to overcome the oppression that women suffer as women is to change the mode of production in the following way: the abolition of the private ownership of the means of production, the creation of a planned economy for the purpose of ending surplus production for private ownership, socializing domestic labor and child-rearing, as well as fairly distributing the remainder of the labor of child-rearing and domestic duties among a couple and their children. She does not think the Soviet Union is a good example of such changes, but considers the experience of the Chinese Cultural Revolution to be inspiring. Vogel specifically considers Engels' origin of the family, private property, and the state as the source of the theory that separates the foundation of sexual oppression from that of class oppression. In the introduction to his work, Engels wrote, "According to the materialistic conception, the determining factor in history is, in the last resort, the production and reproduction of immediate life. But this itself is of twofold character. On the one hand, the production of the means of subsistence, of food, clothing, and shelter, and the tools requisite therefore. On the other, the production of human beings themselves, the propagation of the species. The social institutions are conditioned by both kinds of production, by the state of development of labor on the one hand, and of the family on the other." In her opinion, also Vogel, this passage unconsciously created the basis for what later became theorized as dual systems theory by some socialist feminists. It identified the source of women's oppressions as independent of class oppression and the social relations of production of each society. This view, she argues, has damaged socialist feminism because it reduces the basis of women's oppression to the ideology of patriarchy without a material foundation in economic relations. Dual systems theory, which ultimately became the dominant theory among socialist feminists, was elaborated in detail in Michelle Barrett's Women's Oppression Today, the Marxist-Feminist Encounter. Barrett thinks that the specific oppression which women experience as women is relatively independent of the capitalist mode of production or any other mode of production. She considers the origin of this oppression to be the ideology of familialism. To further explain this view, she cites Louis Althusser's concept of ideology as relatively independent of the mode of production. Unlike Anne Forman, who considers gender identities such as femininity and masculinity under capitalism to be expressions of false consciousness, Barrett thinks that gender identity and the ideology of the family are embedded in our subjectivity and our desires at a far more profound level than that of false consciousness. She defines this ideology by citing Simone de Beauvoir's concept of the relationship of self to other as a relationship of domination that inheres in human beings. In later editions of Women's Oppressions Today in 1988 and 2014, Barrett emphasizes that her concept of ideology is indebted to Michel Foucault's anti-humanism and his concept of power and domination. Power understood in processual and microsocial terms, rather than as an aspect of social structure. She states that if she could rewrite this book, she would have focused much more on Foucault's theories. One of the reasons for Barrett's focus on the relative and later complete independence of the ideology of familialism from the mode of production is her dissatisfaction with the limitations of the theory which views oppression as based on women's domestic labor. Although Barrett admits that capitalism benefits from the sexual division of labor, women's domestic labor and the separation of the domestic sphere from the realm of wage labor, she argues, it is more difficult to argue that gender division necessarily occupies a particular place in the class structure of capitalism. It has not, at least yet, been demonstrated that the sexual division of labor forms not simply a historically constituted but a logically pre-given element of the class structure of capitalism. In order to prove this claim, first, Barrett argues that with the widespread use of computers, the separation of the domestic sphere from the sphere of wage labor, a characteristic of industrial capitalism, is no longer a functional prerequisite of capitalist production. Secondly, she argues that under capitalism too, it is possible to socialize domestic labor and child-rearing to an increasing extent. In other words, in her opinion, reorganizing capitalist relations of productions without the need for women's domestic labor and the nuclear family is entirely possible. Because, quote, I'm not wholly convinced that this household structure is potentially the most beneficial for capital, unquote. And because, quote, this particular form of household and its accompanying ideology of women's dependence is not the only possible form for an efficient reproduction of labor power in capitalist relations of production. I'm on page 4, and these are 8 pages. I don't know if we have sufficient time.
Actually, based on my timing, it's going to take 8 more minutes to finish the paper.
What did she say?
She said it based on her findings.
Can I go
it's
to
take 8 more minutes to finish the paper?
Can I go to page 8 then?
It takes 8 more minutes.
No,
It takes 8 more
minutes to finish the paper.
Yes, if I read like very, very much quicker and then cannot be translated. I have just read half of the paper. Okay, I'll continue and you stop me. Or do you prefer for me to go further and to read the last part?
No, why don't you just read it until before you get to the summation, and maybe I can discuss the summation in the discussion.
I didn't understand.
I think she did say go to the summation.
Summation? Okay.
No, before the summation.
Okay, I see. Most of it is...
Before you get to where it's
I understand. Sorry, most of the pages is just references. Since women's emancipation was not truly realized in the Soviet Union and Maoist China, societies which Barrett considers socialist, she thinks that women's lives in a socialist society will not be much different from capitalism. Hence, although Barrett called herself a socialist feminist in 1980, in the later editions of her book, in 1988 and 2014, she called herself a liberal feminist and emphasized that the realm of culture and ideology were much more fertile than the economic and social concerns of socialist thought. She was no longer interested in merging Marxism and feminism. Barrett offers some cogent criticisms of the theory that grounds women's oppression in their domestic labor. However, her concept of power as an ideology independent of the mode of production closes the door to further consideration of the relationship between women's oppression and the social division of labor. In contrast, Raya Dunayevskaya, Rosa Luxemburg, Women's Liberation and Marx's Philosophy of Revolution, that was the title, returns to a theory that grounds women's oppression in the mental manual division of labor. Hers is the first socialist feminist work to take up Marx's ethnological notebooks from the last decade of his life, where she discerns fundamental differences between the views of Marx and those of Engels, Origin of the Family. In presenting her research, Dunajewskaja argues that from Marx's standpoint, the elements of oppression in general and of women's oppression in particular arose from within primitive communism and not only related to change from matriarchy, but began with the establishment of ranks, relationship of chief to mass, and the economic interests that accompanied it, unquote. From Engels' standpoint, however, primitive societies were free of any oppression. According to Engels, it was only with the production of a surplus in the newly emerging agricultural societies and the private ownership of this surplus by men that the origins of oppression arose. Dunajewskaja attributes Marx's more critical stance to the fact that his attention as a Hegelian philosopher was always directed at the deepest internal contradictions of any society. Hence, she argues that his concept of socialism went far beyond the abolition of the private property of the means of production and embodied the transformation of all human relations. In examining primitive societies, Marx emphasized women's greater freedom in these relatively egalitarian societies, but also focused on the existence of ranks, wars between tribes, the capture of members of other tribes, and the limitations imposed on women within those very societies. At the same time, he continued to examine the elements of resistance to oppression, as well as the different historical paths of development in different societies. He couldn't have agreed with Engels' expression, the world historical defeat of the female sex. Based on her grasp of Marx, Dunajewskaja attributes the formation of classes in general and women's oppression in particular to the mental manual division of labor, a division of labor that becomes more intense under capitalism, is expressed in alienated labor and affects all human relationships, including love relationships. To sum up, Forman, Barrett, Vogel, and Dunajewskaja have all made important efforts in theorizing the specificity of gender oppression. All except Forman have found it necessary to criticize the limitations of Friedrich Engels' Origin of the Family, private property, and the state. Engels' view that the development of private property was the source of women's oppressions is simply reductionist, inadequate, and does not answer important questions. Whether Engels' views in the Origin of the Family were shared by Marx is, however, a matter that all the above thinkers, except Dunajewskaja, assume to be true. Dunajewskaja discerns major differences between the views of Engels and Marx, not only based on comparing the Origin of the Family with Marx's ethnological notebooks, but also based on examining Marx's body of ideas as a whole. She argues that Engels, despite his contributions, did not have the depth of Marx's critical vision and did not go beyond biological determinism, unilinear evolutionism, and reducing socialism to an updated version of primitive communism. Another issue on which the above thinkers exhibit important differences is the concept of the family. Forman considers the nuclear family to be a permanent feature of capitalist society. Vogel, like Forman, mainly considers the nuclear family to be compatible with capitalist society. However, Barrett and Dunajewskaja emphasize the changes and transformations in the institution of the family even within capitalism. Barrett specifically argues that capitalism can develop without the nuclear family and can adjust itself to newer and more advanced forms of the family, including families based on same-sex couples. We think that this view seems to be more compatible with Marx's own discussion of the family in the chapter of Machinery and Large-Scale Industry in Capital, Volume 1. Finally, Forman and Dunajewskaja both relate women's oppression in capitalism to alienation and specifically alienated labor. However, there are differences in their views concerning the overcoming of alienation. Forman thinks that alienated labor can be overcome through the abolition of the sale of labor power and the abolition of exchange in the market. Dunayevskaya views the sale of labor power and exchange in the market as the result of a mode of production based on an intense mental manual division of labor, the domination of machines over human beings, and the domination of socially necessary labor time over the process of labor. A related difference between these two thinkers concerns their views on the nature of the former Soviet Union and Maoist China. Forman considers them bureaucratic socialist societies. Dunayevskaya had analyzed these states and their satellite states as state capitalist societies. In our translator's introduction to the Persian translation of Heather Brown's Marx on Gender and the Family, we have tried to address and evaluate these questions, as well as more recent Marxist-Feminist critiques and discussions of Marx in more depth. We invite conference participants to read the English translation of this introduction in full. Okay?
Okay. Thank you.